continues.
We're joined now by Congressman Brad Sherman, Democrat of California, member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, to start with, the Russian military buildup on the Ukraine border and the talks that are happening this week between U.S. and Russian officials. Tell our audience, in your opinion, why the security of Ukraine matters.
Well, I think we have an investment in the entire world order, particularly peace in Europe. Russia has already seized some Ukrainian territory. That was a while ago. We need peace and stability in Europe. It's hard to say that there's any part of the world that's totally unnecessary or totally not of concern to the United States, but Europe has always been a place that we've been gravely concerned since the days of World War I. Having grown up during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, I see a real need to put a lot of diplomatic effort into making sure that the two nuclear superpowers, the two that have enough nuclear weapons to really destroy life on Earth, are kept peaceful.
How should the U.S. respond if Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, decides to strike against Ukraine?
Well, by far the biggest response will be the Ukrainian response, and the biggest response America will make is what we've already done in arming the Ukrainians and training their military. The number one reason Putin hasn't invaded is that he will suffer significant casualties. I remember pushing a decade or so ago when our policy was not to provide the Ukraine with lethal military assistance. We'd provide jeeps, but not. I mean, I remember arguing that guns aren't lethal. After all, it's only the bullet that's lethal. I think the Ukrainian military is far better equipped and trained today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. Far better than when the Russians seized the Crimea. And that's the number one reason why Putin hasn't invaded. In addition to that, he'll suffer substantial economic sanctions. But we have been timid in imposing economic sanctions on Putin when he does other things. He interfered in our 2016 election, and we did almost nothing. Now and then our State Department will exaggerate what we did, but basically our main sanction was to tell some hackers in St. Petersburg that they're not going to get tourist visas, they're never going to see the real Disneyland, they're going to have to settle for Euro Disney. And coming from California, I realize seeing Mickey Mouse in France is no substitute. But in terms of sanctions that really hit the Russian state, we almost gave them a pass on 2016.
So what should the U.S. do on sanctions?
Well, I think we do need to keep our powder dry, but it has to be plain to Russia that the Nord Stream pipeline is over and their access to Western capital markets is done if they invade the Ukraine. But as I said, the number one deterrent is the Ukrainian military, and we have to be providing them with weapons and assistance now, not with Americans anywhere near the front lines, but it's that military. Not that Russia couldn't defeat them, but will the Russian populace accept the kind of casualties that the Ukrainian military can impose? As of yet, I don't think so.
How do you respond to the Russian president when he argues that the support of the West for Ukraine is NATO expansion and something that he sees as a threat to his country?
Well, I do think that we have to have understandings of not having missiles right up against the Russian border. We reacted rather intensely when we saw nuclear missiles based in Cuba, 90 miles and separated by ocean away from us. Ukraine is even closer to Russia. So I do think that an understanding on force deployments is appropriate. And I think that some assurance that there's no, that for many decades we would expect that the Ukraine would not be joining NATO. If you look at the NATO treaty, it really doesn't allow the Ukraine to join because Article 5 says that the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory would trigger a war between the United States and Russia the day Ukraine joined NATO. And Article 10 says that the Ukraine can't join NATO unless it makes the other countries in NATO, such as the United States, more secure. I, as one American, would not feel more secure if my country was in a technical state of war with Russia tomorrow or the next day. So the NATO pact requires that new applicants demonstrate that by joining they make the entire collective body more secure, and that isn't the condition on the ground, neither for the country of Georgia nor the country of the Ukraine. So I don't think that Ukraine or Georgia will be joining anytime soon. As a practice, the way the NATO treaty is designed now, it in effect gives Russia a veto. If you occupy part of a nation's territory, it's very difficult for that country to join NATO. Obviously, that NATO treaty could be revised in light of these circumstances, but I don't think that the Biden administration was certainly not thinking of being the administration to be in the White House when the Ukraine or any other former part of the Soviet Union became a new member of NATO.
Let's get to calls. Congressman Michael in Imperial Beach, California. Democratic caller.
Good morning, Greta. Good morning, Representative Sherman. Representative Sherman, I think there's one issue that the Republicans and the Democrats can really get over. I mean, can really get together on. We got Russia, we got Putin. He took Crimea. He's on Ukraine. He's on Kazakhstan. We got Xi Jinping, who he's going to take Taiwan, I think. So I just was hoping that if the Democrats and the Republicans can't get together over this issue, we have two madmen out there, in my opinion. And what are your thoughts on that, Representative? Thank you.
Well, I think that the lines are different on some of these issues of foreign policy. They're not strictly Democrat against Republican. There's more bipartisanship, perhaps, but there isn't necessarily agreement. There are those who think that we should spend tens of billions of dollars more enhancing our Navy's ability to repulse any effort to retake Taiwan or to take Taiwan. And there are those who don't think we should do that. There are the doves and the hawks, and increasingly, although you associate the Republican Party with the hawks, it's not quite that simple. And you get to the libertarian, the Rand Paul wing of the Republican Party, and you find Republicans who, while they'll certainly denounce Xi and China and Putin and Russia, they're very reluctant, and I think all Americans are at least somewhat reluctant to see our troops get involved. If Putin could be deterred only with the risk of economic sanctions and only with international law, harsh condemnation, I think everybody in this country could unite behind that. But the prospect of Americans on the front line, that scares some Democrats and some Republicans.
What does the unrest in Kazakhstan do to this dynamic right now?
Well, certainly it wasn't something that Putin was planning on. I think he may be removing his troops relatively soon. It's a terrible shame that the Kazakh people do not have the democracy that they deserve. This government has no legitimacy, and while Nazarbayev, the dictator of many decades, is theoretically gone, his regime remains and was not able to kill enough demonstrators without Russian help, enough demonstrators to achieve their thuggish purpose of remaining in power without making any concessions to the people. So I think that it's certainly a tragedy for democracy that we're not seeing the government of Kazakhstan forced to make at least some concessions to their own people.
Kelly in Pittsburgh, Democratic caller.
Hello, Congressman. I first feel that I wish Senator McCain was here. He was on top of all of this years and years ago, and it's just unbelievable to me that we have allowed Russia to penetrate as much as they already have. But my greatest concern is, why aren't there standards for withdrawing our troops in emergency situations that are automatically done at a time, whether it's with the airlines or if it's, destroying guns so that the enemy doesn't get those guns? I just don't understand why there's not an automatic standard, and I hope that you all will consider that and put that in place.
Well, from ancient times, retreats have been the most difficult military maneuver. And I think your question is really focused on Afghanistan. We've pulled some troops out of Syria. We've shifted our situation. One would say that we don't have a military, a combat role in Iraq. Obviously, though, when you look at Vietnam, we're all haunted by the sights of the helicopter taking off the embassy. Of course, we had withdrawn, but we left billions, and that was back when billions was a big number, of weapons in the hands of the South Vietnamese military, because we wanted to give that military a chance to fight the North Vietnamese. As it turned out, they did a terrible job. They folded quickly. There are some that will say, well, we should have given them more air support or this or that. I mean, we fought it. We died by the tens of thousands to try to support that regime. You can't disarm your ally and say, well, you want your ally to survive on their own. Likewise, in Afghanistan, imagine how many Americans would have died if we had deployed our troops all around Afghanistan saying, we're collecting the weapons. We've decided you guys are losers. Give us back the guns. The plan was for the Afghan military to fight the Taliban to a draw, at least, and to negotiate a settlement. Obviously, that failed. It had only a slight chance of success. But imagine the reaction in the world, in the United States, if we had disarmed the Afghan government rather than give them a chance to survive, a chance that they were not able, they blew. So I don't think we could have taken back the weapons. As to the withdrawal itself, the people, what we saw from Afghanistan were that the people who had friends and an understanding of the United States, the people who spoke English, were making those videos for their friends to see, not saying, please give us some guns so that we can, and some shovels so that we can fight and defend Kabul from the Taliban. The most connected, the most knowledgeable people, the insiders in Afghanistan, all were demanding on those videos they made that we saw in English, get me out of here. This place is going to fall. They're going to kill us. And once the insiders are saying that, we should not have been surprised that that causes a panic when the most knowledgeable people are panicked. And the idea that the Afghan army was going to fight for months so that there'd be an orderly withdrawal, what ordinary Afghan soldier who doesn't speak English, doesn't have American friends, wants to be the last to die once it's certain that the Americans are leaving and their best friends are leaving, and that the insiders are interested in getting out rather than fighting. So once you have a panicked withdrawal, it's very difficult to have an orderly panic withdrawal. There is no book on how to have a country in which all of the insiders are desperate and fleeing, and it's done in an orderly way.
Carol in Rockaway, New Jersey, independent. Good morning, Carol.
Good morning, Greta. Mr. Sherman, I had a feeling from the time I started seeing the headlines regarding Russia and the Ukraine that this was all about the Nord Stream 2, which, as you indicated several times, there is a relationship here. The Nord Stream 2 was a Siberian oil dig. It was engaged in by the two national oil companies of Russia, Gazprom and Rosneft, but it was also coupled with Exxon and Mobil and British Petroleum and so on and so forth. And they have, by their results of the dig, they have acquired a stream of gas and oil to supply Western Germany and all of our all the patrons that used to purchase the American oil and gas. So the situation is always a little deeper if you scratch the surface than what politicians like yourself want to indicate to the public.
Okay, Congressman, your response.
Well, I don't think that Putin is putting his forces around the Ukraine in an effort to help or hurt American or British oil companies. Nord Stream 2, of course, is part of the overall picture. He very much wants that pipeline completed. We are opposed to it in part because it will create an infrastructure where Germany in particular and other Western European countries will be dependent for their natural gas on Russia. And he who supplies the natural gas can turn off the natural gas, and that creates a certain dependency. Russia could impose economic hardship on Germany instead of the West imposing sanctions on Russia. But I don't. I think that the caller has a strong distrust of the institutions of the United States and especially of international oil companies. And I'm not going to say that there aren't some reasons to investigate in both quarters, but I don't see I don't see how those dots connect, except to say that a Germany dependent on Russia is not good for Germany's security. It's not good for America's security, and it's probably the first thing that is stopped if Putin invades Ukraine.
So, Congressman, we learned yesterday from European Free Radio that this pipeline is done. It's ready to deliver natural gas, according to the operator. So, if you put sanctions on it, what would happen?
Well, you'd have according to that news story, completed, according to the latest I saw, almost completed pipeline that wouldn't have any use for a while. And would be prohibited from operation. Again, I hope very much that Putin doesn't invade the Ukraine. I don't think he will. And so in all likelihood, Putin will extract only some minor concessions, will decide not to invade, and will get the economic and geostrategic advantages of that pipeline. But there are other scenarios. There is the possibility that he invades, and that creates a worse world and a probably useless pipeline.
Dave in Spokane, Washington, Independent. You're on the air with Congressman Brad Sherman. Go ahead.
Good morning, Greta. I just have an image for Congressman Sherman. Thinking about Russian propaganda, just visualize a great big poster of Uncle Sam wants you to protect the Biden business interests, the family business interest in the Ukraine. That will come out, at some point in time, and how are we going to respond? Thank you very much.
I would say the entire Congress and all of those involved in foreign policy for the last 3 decades have been in favor of an independent Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine, and that Biden is no more in favor of an independent Ukraine than his predecessors, including his immediate predecessor, and no more in favor of an independent Ukraine than the consensus in both the House and the Senate, not only this decade, but last decade and the decade before that. So to ascribe this to business interests that I don't think exist and seem to be invented by those looking for a conspiracy doesn't explain why for 30 years America has had pretty much the same interests and the same objectives in the Ukraine that we have today.
John, Santa Paula, California, Republican.
Good morning. Good morning, America. Good morning, Congressman Sherman. Mm-hmm. My question is, or my feeling is, I've been watching the Ukraine situation over the last month or so, and to me, it is the most important issue of the day. The filibuster, the January, it's all noise compared to this. And what I'm seeing is President Biden slow-walking us into a confrontation with Russia, which could be catastrophic. And he's making some mistakes. I think one big mistake was to announce what his sanctions would be and not realizing that if he imposes sanctions, the price of gas in America will probably triple. And so what is he thinking when he's going to put hardships on the American people to combat Russia? I just think he's making blunder after blunder. He's going to get back himself into a corner. And what has he got to do except fight? So I'm really concerned about the Ukraine issue, and I just don't see President Biden doing anything positive right now to avoid it. And
all right, John. Congressman Sherman.
Well, Biden didn't wake up one day and said, let's have a crisis in the Ukraine. Putin woke up. Those troops on the border are not Biden's idea. That's Putin's forces. Biden very much does not want international distractions. His focus is on domestic policy. This is a crisis Biden does not want. Second, the idea that the gentleman mentions gas, I assume he's talking about natural gas because that's what we were talking about before. We don't import any natural gas from Russia. In fact, the United States exports natural gas. And natural gas is a complicated and expensive thing to move from one continent to another. So it has to be liquefied, and that's an expensive process. So to think that we would ever import natural gas from Russia when we have so much natural gas in the United States that we are liquefying it and exporting it to Asia and now, I will say this, if Russia invades the Ukraine, that isn't Biden's idea, that's Putin's idea, America has to respond. The list of responses we have talked about, but if we didn't talk about them, Putin knows what they are. Anybody who looks at international economics could make pretty much the same list. And if you say, well, Biden shouldn't be mentioning that we're going to take tough action, well, that would be an invitation to Putin to invade the Ukraine. You can say it's bad for Biden to give a speech saying, Putin, if you invade, we're going to hit your economy. Imagine if Biden had given the other speech and said, Putin, if you invade, we're not going to do anything at all economically, and we're certainly not going to lose our soldiers. So we're not going to do anything militarily, and we're not going to do anything economically, but you will get a strongly worded letter. I would say that would increase the likelihood that Putin would invade. Now, of course, the Ukrainians themselves give Putin plenty of reasons not to invade, but at the margin, the ability of the United States to organize not just American, but a worldwide economic sanctions response is something that may keep peace and a fragile peace on the Ukrainian border. So I think Putin has handled. I think Putin has created this crisis. I think Biden is handling it as well as we can under these circumstances. And I don't think that sanctioning Russia would have a significant effect on our economy, but given what we've done in the world, the cost that we've imposed on our soldiers or sailors or Marines in Afghanistan and Iraq, to say that the American people are unwilling to endure any cost to achieve an international objective, I think belies history.
Congressman, we only have a couple of minutes left, so let me ask you, what other areas of the world, as one of the top Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee, what other areas of the world concern you?
Well, obviously China. Both Taiwan, and I do not think that she will invade at this time. It also for similar reasons on the Ukraine, because the Taiwanese would impose great costs on him. I think the economic relationship with China is a very unfair one, in which they are able to use their capricious granting or denying of access to U.S. businesses in order to control our policies and our companies. For example, they only allow about 40 movies into China. So if you're in Hollywood and that's your second biggest market, if you make a movie about Tibet, that movie will never be shown in China. Not only that, none of your other movies will either. So China, by rationing access to its market, can control what every studio in Hollywood makes by making sure they never make a movie that's hostile to Beijing, that's about the Uyghurs, that's about the Tibetans, etc. They can and have recently terrify. You know, if just one executive in the NBA says something nice about Taiwan, they threaten a $1 billion revenue stream. We don't do the same thing. We don't say, oh, well, we're going to stop all Chinese toys from coming to the United States, or only the toy companies that declare that they respect the rights of the Taiwanese people will be allowed to bring in toys to. We don't do that. Their control over their market for political purposes gives them a control in our society that's very pernicious.
Congressman Brad Sherman, Democrat of California, thank you for the conversation as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that does it for today.